Good morning, my dear students. Welcome to the online class on Valuation of Securities. I am Dr. Suprava Sahu, faculty member of the Department of Commerce, Ravenshawuniversity University. Today I am going to discuss about valuation of securities by focusing on bonds, preference shares and equities, which is covered in Unit 1 of the subject Financial Management for BCom Honours 5th semester students. So students, what exactly do you mean by bond? A bond can be defined as an instrument of debt which is issued by a business house or a government unit. As we have studied earlier, debenture is an acknowledgement of a debt. It basically shows that a debt has been taken by a certain person, the borrower, from the lender, and is going to repay the debt by also paying an additional rate of interest in addition to the principal amount. Now, the bonds may be issued either at par or premium or discount. Now, if the bonds are issued at par, it means they are issued at face value. Now, the par value is the amount stated on the face of the bond. It states that the amount the firm borrows and promises to repay at the time of maturity. The bonds carry a fixed rate of interest, which is payable at fixed time intervals. Now, the interest is calculated by multiplying the value of the bonds with the rate of interest. Now, bond valuation, students, is also called as debt valuation because the features that distinguish bonds from other debts are primarily non-financial in nature. Since bonds have a promised payment stream, they are less risky as compared to the shares. Now, while repayment at the time of liquidation of the company, definitely owners of bonds will get priority in comparison to the preference shareholders and the equity shareholders. But it does not necessarily mean that bonds are risk free. They also carry a very high degree of risk, but still compared to the shares, they carry lesser degree of risk. So, the required rate of return on a firm's bond will exceed the risk free interest rate, but will be less than the required rate of return on shares. Now, students, I will discuss with you basically that bonds may be classified into two categories. One is bonds with a maturity period and the other one is bonds in perpetuity. Now, bonds with a maturity period means that they have a fixed time of repayment and the value of the bonds is determined by considering the annual payment of interest plus the maturity value. These are bonds which has fixed maturity period. Now, bonds also are there which are redeemable in installments. Now, here what happens is that the bonds will be redeemed periodically at regular time intervals, and here the principal amount is repaid partially in each period instead of a lump sum at maturity in case of regular bonds. And so, cash outflows in each period include both interest and principal, and the amount of interest goes on decreasing each period as it is calculated on the outstanding amount of the bond or debentures. So, this is advantageous for the borrower as he has to pay less interest on reducing balance method. Another type of bonds is bonds in perpetuity. Bonds in perpetuity means that they do not carry any fixed repayment schedule. They do not have a fixed time for repayment. So, they never mature, or you can say that they have an infinite maturity period, and the value of such bonds refers to the discounted value of infinite streams of interest or cash flows. Now, there is also another method which is called as yield to maturity or the bond's internal rate of return. Now, till now we have assumed that the investor's required rate of return, also called as the discount rate, is given for calculating the value of the bond or the debentures. But in many cases, we may be required to circulate the required rate of return when the cash inflows and the current value or the price of the bond is given. So, this is regarding yield to maturity or internal rate of return. Now, students, I will discuss with you about how to calculate the value of preference shares, which is also called as preferred stock. As all of you know, preference shares are called as such because they carry two types of preferential rights. One is they will be repaid the principal amount first in priority to the equity shareholders at the time of liquidation, And another preferential treatment which the preference shareholders get is that they will get the fixed rate of dividend every year, irrespective of whether the business earns profit or incurs losses. That is why they are called as preference shares. So, preference shares, you can say that they are more risky than bonds, but they are less risky than equity shares. So, they lie somewhere in regard to the risk component, they lie somewhere between the equity shares and the bonds or debentures. Now, preference shares can either have a fixed maturity period or they can have the option of being redeemed after a specific number of years, when they are called as redeemable preference shares. And the valuation of a preference share is very much similar to the valuation of a bond. We can follow different types of formulae for calculating the value of preference shares. And another type of preference shares are perpetual preference shares. Perpetual preference shares means they do not have any fixed maturity period. They are irredeemable and the future dividends are expected to be constant. So, they are called as perpetual preference shares. Now, students will discuss about how to calculate the value of equity shares, which are also called as common stock. Equity shares belong to those people who are the real owners of the company, and they do not carry any fixed rate of dividend like preference shares, but investors who are willing to assume a higher degree of risk always go for preference share, equity shares. Why? Because after paying interest on debt or interest on debentures, interest on loan, dividend on preference shares, whatever residual profits is there belongs to equity shareholders only. And every businessman will try his level best to earn the maximum amount of profits. So, definitely equity shareholders are expected to receive much higher rate of dividend as compared to the fixed dividend which is received by the preference shareholders. So, investors belonging to the risk taking category opt for equity shares, as the degree of risk is also high and the expected rate of dividend is also high. Now, students, basically while finding out the value of equity shares, we follow two models. One model is the capitalization of dividend model and the other model is capitalization of earnings model. First, we will discuss about the dividend capitalization model. Now, students, all of us know that the value of an equity share is a function of cash inflows expected by the investors and the degree of risk associated with the cash inflows. Since degree of risk in case of equity shares is higher, so the expected rate of dividend or the expected cash inflows is also higher as compared to the preference shares. So, the investors expect to receive dividend while holding the shares, and while selling of the equity shares, definitely they have an expectation of capital gains. So, we can say that the value of an equity share is the present value of the future stream of dividends. Whatever dividends are expected in the future, if you calculate the present value, that can be stated to be the value of an equity share. Now, basic valuation and dividend capitalization model can be expressed in various variants. One of them is one period valuation model for calculating the value of equity shares. Now, this model is applicable whenever the equity shareholder has the intention of selling up the equity share after 1 year. He wants to hold it only for 1 year, then he wants to sell it. So, here the value of the equity share will be the present value of the expected dividend at the end of 1 year and the present value of the expected sell price at the end of the year, because his intention is only to hold such shares for 1 year. Now, another variant of the dividend capitalization model is the 2 period valuation model. This model is followed when the equity shareholder has the intention to hold the equity shares only for 2 years and then he wants to sell it. Another one is the n period valuation model. This model is followed when the equity shareholder does not have any intention of selling the equity shares. He wants to hold it for n number of years. Now, under the dividend valuation model of equity shares, what we do is that dividend valuation model, it is the generalized form of common stock valuation, and this model has the concept that many investors do not want to sell away the equity shares in the near future. They want to hold it for a longer period of time. So, some people want to hold it for infinite time period. So, In this case, the present value of the equity share is the capitalized value of an infinite stream of expected future dividends. This was about the dividend valuation model. Now students, I will discuss with you about how we use the earnings capitalization model for finding out the value of equity shares or common stock. Now this model is followed when the earnings of the firm are stable or when there is an expansion situation. So this model is more appropriate in those cases, and in those cases the value of an equity share can be determined by capitalizing the earnings. The earnings of the firm will be stable if the firm neither retains the earnings for future expansion nor it uses any form of external financing like loan from bank, loan from financial institution, bonds, etc. In such a situation, the retention rate, which we denote by small b, is 0, and the growth rate, which is denoted by BR, will also be 0 because G equals to BR. Now students, here G means growth rate and B means retention ratio. And since there is no retention of surplus in this case, so the dividend will be equal to the earnings. There is no retention. And the expansion situation in a firm is when it has got investment opportunities which will generate internal rate of return R. Remember, internal rate of return R equal to the equity capitalization rate, that is denoted by KE. Equity capitalization rate means the cost of capital. So basically students, regarding the valuation of securities, in today's class we have discussed about first of all how we are going to find out the valuation of bonds. Under that we discussed about bonds which have a definite time period of repayment, that is bonds with a fixed maturity period. Then we discussed about bonds redeemable in installments, where the interest payable in subsequent periods will gradually go on decreasing because interest will be calculated on the diminishing balance. And we also discussed about bonds in perpetuity, that is where bonds do not have a definite time period of repayment, they have an infinite maturity period. And students, also today we have discussed about the yield to maturity or the bonds internal rate of return. And after that we discussed about how to find out the value of preference shares or preferred stock. Under this we discussed about how to calculate the value of redeemable preference shares, that is those preference shares where the amount due on the preference shares will be paid back or repaid to the shareholders after a fixed time period. It will be redeemed after a specific time period. We also discussed about how to calculate the value of irredeemable preference shares where they do not have a fixed time period of repayment, or which is also called as perpetual preference shares, where the future dividends are expected to be constant and the preference shares are expected to be held for infinite time period. And students, in the later discussion we also discussed about how to calculate the value of equity shares, which is also called as common stock, and how we discussed that equity shareholders are those category of shareholders who are always willing to assume higher degree of risk because they expect higher rate of return. And in case of equity shares we discussed about the two models, that is the dividend capitalization model, and we also discussed about the earnings capitalization model. Under the dividend capitalization model we discussed about 1 period valuation model, 2 period valuation model, n period valuation model. And we also discussed about how to calculate the value of equity shares under this model. And after that, towards the later part of today's class, we discussed about how we are going to apply the earnings capitalization model for finding out the value of equity shares. And this model is basically followed when the earnings of the firm are stable and there is an expansion situation. And it is more appropriate in case of those firms where firm neither retains its earnings nor it uses any form of external financing. So students, today we have discussed in this online class about valuation of bonds and securities, which is covered in unit 1 of financial management for the BCom Honors 5th semester students. I am Dr. Suprava Sahu, faculty member of the Department of Commerce, wishing you all to stay home, stay safe, and thank you. God bless you. Thank you.